everyone, my name is Shawn, also known as Swyx on the internet, and I'm here to talk to you about the radiating circles of dev experience. Just to give you the bottom line up front, because that can be a kind of bombastic statement. We're going to talk a little bit about what makes an end-to-end developer experience. We're going to talk about how to construct a developer journey so your developer is covered from start to finish, and then we're going to combine these insights into some more of a complete concept of developer experience that you can take home and actually apply at your jobs. So who am I? I'm Swyx, also known as Shawn. I'm from Singapore. I had originally started out doing quantitative trading and investing in a hedge fund. Was at Two Sigma, Netlify, AWS, and Temporal, most recently as head of developer experience. On the side, I was also the moderator of the r/reactjs subreddit. I started Svelte Society and the DevTools Angels Discord. And for my book, I also run the Coding Career community. So a fair amount of community and developer evangelism in my background as well. So the first thing I need to figure out for this conference, because this is a DevX conference and some people come from different backgrounds, is to really articulate the difference between where my biases are and where your biases may come from. So a lot of you may come from sort of the internal DX type of organization where you're focused on internal developer tooling for your coworkers. I want to be very clear that I really love those kinds of teams. I think there should be way more of you than there are today. But mostly my focus is on external DX, which is I work at developer tools companies trying to improve the lives of developers that I do not work with on a day-to-day basis, just evangelizing and helping others with the tools that the companies that I work with. So that can be anything from content marketing, speaking, workshops and events, demos, sales. You can read, but I think a lot of this boils down to developer advocacy and then the associated disciplines behind that. Some surprising examples of people that are developer tools companies that have developer advocates that you might not think of as developer tools companies. For example, Slack, Spotify, and Notion, they all have APIs and therefore they serve developers. When you get to a certain size, every company becomes a developer tools company. All right, and for more detail, you can check out my InfraEng interview with Will Larson. So I want to start out with a little bit of my story with Netlify. So when I first started out as a developer advocate, I was the second developer hire at Netlify, and we really didn't have any sort of playbook. They just kind of let us figure it out as we go along. So the first thing that I did was content for content's sake. So they really didn't care what we wrote about or what we created. They just cared that we got traffic back to Netlify, that Netlify was present in everybody's brand, in everybody's head. And I think that was sort of the brand recognition effort of Netlify. So what I did was I ended up writing about documenting dependencies. Then I started being a React journalist. Then I went to an event and wrote out events, that kind of stuff that gets you a few likes and social media exposure, nothing huge. But I think at least if you can churn these out consistently, you're actually doing something valuable for your company that you work at, which is establishing the association between their brand and the target audience that they're trying to look after. So you can see a lot of other companies, for example, DigitalOcean, pursue this kind of thing pretty aggressively. LogRocket is another one that's pretty prominent these days. It wasn't long before I had my first hit. And this is what a hit looks like, which is one article that just gets virally shared by people that I don't even know and never even talk to. And it's just really cool to see that, right? And I think what a hit looks like for you personally is that you start to be very associated with the thing that everyone kind of knows you for. And I think that's a really positive angle. But if you wrote content for content's sake, like it probably was more focused on the end user who doesn't care that much about your company. So it's super top of funnel stuff. And to have them convert starts to be the next challenge. And I definitely started to feel some pressure to write about, Netlify stuff. And so instead of writing about other people's projects on our blog, I did pivot a little bit to writing about Netlify on other people's blogs. And so here is me writing on the FreeCodeCamp blog about Netlify and how the integration works, and making some funny memes around what that looks like. And also sometimes it's not just writing, of course, you can also work on a giant YouTube channel or YouTube video and contribute it for free, for example, also on the FreeCodeCamp channel. So I think outbound content starts to be more the focus when people really want to establish, get your company's products in front of developers where they are. And so the large media channels out there, they all work with partners, and it's really good to figure out how to work together with them if you can. I think the other thing about dev advocacy, like a lot of people think that dev advocates, travel the world and do a lot of conference speaking. And that's definitely true in my experience. Here's some of the samples of events and conferences that I spoke at. Not all of them were in person, some of them were remote, but it gives you an idea of the amount of travel. These days, I would definitely say, not just for COVID, but also just for environmental reasons, that these days are over. That I would strongly advise any dev experience or DevRel teams to not do this, and to really focus your efforts on a few events per year that you can have a really good showing at, and then spend the rest of the time being very good online. All right, so what does very good online mean? You're making content, mostly content marketing. And I think the main thing that I want to raise awareness of here is that every goal that you pick has a trade-off, and maybe you're not really thinking through what the trade-off means. So the top diversion, or the top dichotomy in marketing, is whether you're going for brand or you're going for performance. The performance meaning that you want to measure the amount of click-through, like this attribute, this post is directly attributable to this user signing up and then this user paying, and therefore every post that you put out has like $5 in return on investment, something like that. Whereas brand is much less about direct attribution and more about general recognition, and hopefully that is a long-term play that eventually feeds back into the bottom line. You can also think about topical versus evergreen, the lifespan of your content or half-life of your content. You can talk about incremental versus comprehensive. Do you want the comprehensive ultimate from beginner to expert guide, or do you want the change log for people who are already familiar with your story and you want to just give updates? You can also think about whether it's surface level introductory versus success driven, which is going past introductory into some kind of production deployment and dealing with all the not so nice to demo issues along the way. You can think about the mediums that you've pursued: text versus video versus audio, live versus async, online versus offline, and bottom up versus top down. The bottom up versus top down thing definitely comes more into play with the division between developer advocates and, let's say, enterprise marketing or solutions architecture, because developer advocates typically cater to the bottom up approach, but a good top down perspective can get you very, very far as well if you can have some input on that. I think that would be very constructive. Beyond that, we also dabbled a lot. I also dabbled a lot in integrations, which is engineering, which is coding on whatever was the sort of product perspective. And so we were big contributors to one of Netlify's key efforts, which is Netlify Dev, which was a CLI thing. And it was one of our most successful launches ever, especially on Hacker News. And then after that, after you sort of work on a product, you can then write very authentic content on the product because you helped to build it. The other thing that developer advocates or developer experience people do is docs, or I guess the second last thing, because I have one more thing to show you. The docs are also very interesting. This comes out of just being a power user of the platform and then looking around the docs and constantly realizing there's stuff that you look up or have in your head that is just not reflected in the docs. And for me, I noticed that I was constantly looking up some environment variables that were kind of scattered all over the docs and never really listed in one place. And so what I did was I went through and did this big exercise. I just compiled this big fat list of Netlify environment variables. And once I did that, I had my reference, and eventually that made its way into the docs. And I think that's also a very powerful way of the developer being a voice and advocate for the user by being a power user and also talking with a lot of users and understanding their pain, or maybe understanding what they did not know and seeing the commonality and identifying one solution that might solve all that common issues. Finally, we're talking about community, and here I have a couple more examples. So this is not precisely my work because I wasn't a specialist in this, but community can be about maintaining a Slack community for people to talk about broader issues that are, that it may be a global support channel, and that's okay, or it might be a place where people learn about the general issues surrounding the industry. It might be about organizing events and getting people to those events, whether it's a meetup or a conference, and then running a Slack that people just hang out in all day long and get to know each other, get to hire each other, and get to learn about the upcoming news of the day. And I think those are very valuable things you can build around a community that makes people feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. Not just your users, but also your employees, which is also pretty helpful as well. So a little bit more on why community. I do have a feeling that community is all about the people, and code is sort of written by people, and if you can scale people who code, I think that's kind of like the best of both worlds. But it takes a real weird, it occupies a very weird space in developer careers right now, because community managers typically are less well paid than engineers, and so who would want to be a community manager when you can just code? And I think that is there's a core tension that founders and managers are going to have to face because they're seeing that, hey, communities are very valuable, and they scale the impact of your company much more than the immediate number of employees that you can have. So it's basically a growth hack if you can manage to figure out a really good community, and otherwise it's a cost. And so you want to make it much more of a profit center than a cost center by making a self-sustaining community. So one example of that I did was to establish the Svelte Society community. This was a side project for me that turned into something that became very serious, both at Vercel and Netlify, but also for Svelte Society itself. So basically, I think once for me, like, I identified that there was something that was in the air that was waiting for it to happen, and being an initiator and organizer of it, this was the first tweet about Svelte Society. This was the first meetup that was ever organized, and we got together. We had no space, we had no venue, we had no speakers, we had no people, but we all got that together in a week, got an event set up, and eventually 30 people showed up. And I think that was the start of it. And that you can sort of see in the numbers when we started, really kicking things into gear. And over time, that started translating into industry survey results. We saw it at the top right there. And then finally, more and more conferences, and getting 15,000 people over the course of 2.5 years. I think this is one example of a community that was ready for something to happen. And you needed a community organizer or a core group of contributors who are passionate about the project to kick it into gear, and then everyone else will follow along. Because there's a small group of people who make these things happen, and then there's others who just much prefer to be passive because obviously they have other stuff going on in their lives. What I think the value comes from is basically expressed in Eric Ries's model of crossing the chasm, right? Why does community have any value at all? Is because a lot of startups are on the left side of this curve, in the adoption curve, right? Like, there's a bunch of people who adopt technologies because they solve their problems, and that's about it. And that's all they want. That's all they really need. But there's a very large group of people who look at other metadata around their technology, right? Like how many jobs are there? How many third-party ecosystem tools are there? Are my friends using this tool, and do they say it's good? If they do, that social proof does mean for a lot. And Eric Ries's whole point about the chasm is that there's a huge chasm in here. And what community building means is taking that community from 0 to 1 and starting to build that social proof and that momentum, such that people feel like it's not such a risky bet after all. Like, hey, it's got the core things, and I see all the right things trending in the right direction. This is my time to join, and that helps the company or dev tool cross the chasm. That's something I think a developer experience engineer can really start engineering for with the tools that we're going to talk about in this talk. So that brings us to sort of the $10,000 question: what do developer experience engineers do? I think there are going to be a lot of speakers today that are talking about this, and I'm really excited to learn about all the different perspectives. I'm going to give you one perspective on this that we've arrived at through the companies that I've been working with. But please, don't feel this authoritative or anything. I think this is just something that you should consider, because I'm sure you're looking for different mental models of how to do your job better, or if you're hiring for a DevX role, like, what could you possibly hire for, and what could you sort of possibly measure for? So let's get right into it. At Netlify, we eventually arrived at this distribution of developer experience, which is integrations engineering, developer and experience engineering, and documentation, which covers a few measures of what you saw in my presentation before. And I think the thing that's probably missing here is that community is kind of community and content are kind of subsumed under advocacy, and I think that's okay if you want something that is sort of more engineering focused, right? You're really emphasizing the engineer part of developer experience engineering. For more details, you can definitely check out the authoritative article written by Sarah, who's our VP of DX at the time. So personally, I think that is a really good perspective, and that's definitely been influential in my thinking. I really like this quote from Theodore Levitt, who talks about this, right? Like when you as a company, you as a startup, you're selling a solution, but people don't want the solution, they want the results, right? Like they don't want quarter-inch rows, they want quarter-inch holes. The problem with developers is that typically you're selling a general purpose tool with a lot of different use cases that you could possibly use it for, and probably you want your users to be more creative than you are in telling you what they use it for, right? In other words, there are a lot of different types of holes, and you don't really know in advance what you're trying to tell your users to do, because it's up to them. They just kind of explain the functionality and let them figure it out, because you're building for builders. So that gives you a fundamental problem, right? Like you have a drill, you have a tool, you're trying to sell people the tool. I think what DevX is more like is a drill with interchangeable bits that you can kind of swap in and out based on the condition, based on the terrain, whatever it is that you're trying to do. So if I flip this drill around, you can start to build a nice little mental model of how DevX works together with products and the rest of the startup, right? You have a core product that's built by engineering and product management. That's the core of the drill. That's the thing that doesn't change. But the stuff that does change is how the interfaces with the rest of the user community. Or if I want this drill, maybe I go for the integrations. If I want other stuff, I want docs, I want content, I want community. A DevX engineer should be able to sort of flip between each of these pretty fluently and try to achieve the desired result, right? And whoever is sort of managing that developer experience should be able to identify gaps in hey, I don't have enough content, and that's the ultimate rate limiting factor for us in getting the results that we want. So in short, what do those DevX engineers do? They help to bridge products all the way to community and to work on these in concentric circles. So why do I talk about concentric circles? Well, really because most products don't stay in one product. You start having multiple products. And if you have this sort of stack of docs, content, community for each of these products, it starts to look very disjoint. So ultimately, you want to sort of make them cohesive, make them look like a whole, and that looks more like a circle than it does pyramids of content and people. So that's ultimately kind of where I see that is, but it starts to evolve a little bit more than that, because you can have different size circles, right? So for example, I was talking with someone for Snowflake the other day, and he told me actually, we got pretty far in the journey without any DevRel. In other words, they didn't bother with any content. They just wrote the product, made the product, wrote the docs, and then let the community take over, did direct sales. And that was about it. They didn't have DevRel for a very, very long time. When did Stripe start doing developer relations? Only a couple of years ago. So that's a very interesting method around that. I think a lot of other maybe smaller SaaS companies don't even bother with community at all. So they do products, they do docs, and then they spend a whole lot of time on content marketing, much more. What this model tells you is that, hey, there's a lot of things that you could be doing. You can vary the size of your circles depending on your situation and your desired goals, right? Like if you think that you're going to do a lot of direct sales, then don't even bother with content. Just kind of let your community take over and get to it. And if you want to pursue a more SEO type play and you're more of a point solution, then maybe just go after content. So that seems like we solved it. We have arrived at radiating circles. Is that all it is? And I would like to push you a little bit harder. So Chris Coyier actually wrote about this, has been writing about DX for a long time. And I was very honored when he picked on a blog post that I wrote, which is developer exception engineering, which is this idea that a lot of the developer experience people spend a lot of time on the happy path, like how to get started. Hey, did you know it's so easy to get hello worlds? And then they stop there. And all the really nasty parts, like the missing features, the downtime, the deprecation, the bad docs, the building, the roadmap, I guess kind of swept under the rug for users to find when they actually buy the marketing line, and then they get too deep to back out. So I want to zoom in on this. Like, it's all about the hidden WTFs in a developer experience, and how do you sort of prepare people for that? Because ultimately, if you can give them warnings about that, or give them mitigations ahead of time in anticipation of their needs, they're going to trust you a lot more. And that is real developer experience, right? That is real end-to-end developer experience. So how do you drive that in effort? You also start thinking about the other, pulling from outside of the development field. And when I think about who's the best at just general experience, I think about games, right? Like the design of the Mario game, it's structured such that it's sort of incrementally introducing new patterns to you and really forgiving if you get things wrong. In fact, all of the Mario game was kind of designed on graph paper like this, very, very intentionally designed such that you start learning interactions with the map as you go along, right? There's no docs. You don't read docs when you play games. You play games purely just to be fun, just to have fun. And game designers are probably the best at experience because their existence is dependent on you being able to learn and have fun using the tool instead of fighting it. So how do we apply game design to developer experience? So here's an example of like a typical documentation site with not much of the game design applied to it, right? Like when I look at the information architecture of the documentation, it's kind of all over the place, and it's usually up to you to find some authoritative set that maybe tells you, what there is to use and learn, and it can be quite a mess to keep in your head. So ultimately, what I want you to focus on is how long does it take to learn your tool? And there's a few levels to this. So one example, you can go by number of minutes per medium. So you can sort of, if you're reading the landing page or, so the introductory docs, maybe aim for 10 minutes. If it's by video, 30 minutes, if by workshop, 2 to 3 hours. And having a good syllabus for all of these things and working it out such that you can fit it all within some kind of manageable length, I think is a reasonable goal, right? Reading, of course, there should be complete docs, but you should have some kind of reasonable introduction that doesn't go too long, that people can get. And so a lot of effort can be spent in just making this first 10 minutes, first 30 minutes, first 2 to 3 hours really, really good. All right. And how I approach it is by drawing a map, because the one thing that you cannot disagree on is what part of your API is user facing, which is above the waterline, right? Because other than that, everything is a human construct. What you call continents, what are landmarks to you, and what are journeys between landmarks. All of these are up to interpretation and up to variation and change over time. But what's above water, at least in the time of not climate change, like I think it's reasonable to think about that as the baseline, right? So mapping out, here's a sort of feature mapping process that we did at Temporal, and basically it just means meticulously going through and just identifying what feature exists where, and figuring out, especially for very deep and broad products, what that looks like. So for here, this is the whole process. I have a whole talk on this on the Temporal YouTube. You can check it out if you want. It means going through every single feature, tagging them by like what it is they do and where they're likely to do it, grouping the features by what's adjacent, like the features that you're likely to use together, and then summarizing and simplifying them into categories that kind of make sense for all of these features. Like when you want this, kind of go in this direction. When you want that, go in this direction, and then go learn about the neighboring APIs all in one place. And then finally, drawing journeys for different developer profiles. Right? If you want, everybody starts at the core, and then based on what you need, you can go through and tour the world in different order if you want, based on your needs. Finally, I want to talk to you about the 2x2. So basically pick 2 dimensions that you really care about. So here, for example, happy path, unhappy path, visible, invisible. This is just a suggestion. I don't really care what specifically, just pick the 2 that you care most about for your users. And then, for example, try to think about like the big categories that you really want, and then mapping them on into some kind of 2x2 matrix where you at least understand like, all right, a lot of people are going to spend the time on visible happy path features, but don't forget the other three that really count for developer exceptions, which is what I wrote about in that blog post. All right, so finally, we have reached, we've gotten ourselves to the bottom line, which is the combination of figuring out an end-to-end developer experience, understanding a developer journey, and then understanding, all right, if I want to go in the way of monitoring and observability, I need the product to align that way, then the docs, then the content and the community, and get everything to sync in one cohesive whole. So that's a mental model for you for developer experience. I have blasted through all these mental models for you because I've lived this for the past 5 years, and I really do believe that it has helped me clarify a lot of questions, and it's a really good starting point for asking the real hard questions. Okay, with that, we've reached the end of my talk. If you want more where that came from, if you want to talk about measurement, which I know is always a hot topic, you can come check out my blog post on measuring developer relations. Just Google it, and we can talk about how this products, content, community split breaks down in terms of KPIs. But otherwise, you can contact me on my email or my Twitter or my personal site, and I'll see you around. Bye.